This is the Truth Network.
Hidden treasures of the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. What a treasure we have coming off of Christmas in the 11th verse in the 8th chapter of the Song of Solomon. And wow, I think the whole Bible comes together in so many different ways, and certainly the Song of Solomon comes together here as we are heading into the conclusion. We just have a few more verses left, and here we get another amazing teaching from Solomon, and there are so many things in the Bible that get connected here. It's unbelievable. It is the hoof verse, which is very significant in understanding the verse, in my opinion, and we'll get into all that. But that letter hoof is like a crown that goes over the top of your head and has a whole lot to do with desire. And so as we jump into this, verse 11, Solomon had a vineyard at Baalhamon. He let out the vineyard unto keepers. Every one for the fruit thereof was to bring 1,000 pieces of silver. So the couple has been talking about, their children, and we believe that, that if they're a wall and or if they are a door. And so now, and we realize that the bride was a total package. Well, here we see that the king, Solomon, he is the total package, as it starts out with. When it says Solomon, of course, that whole idea of shalom is the same thing she just left off with, was saying that she was the Shulamite, or she was going to be in peace based on the fact that she'd have been adorned with so much from her beloved. And so, here, it begins off with that whole idea of shalom when it says Solomon, right? And you can see that part of the completeness of that is this vineyard. And you might note that the Bible starts off with a garden, and as the Song of Solomon started out with a vineyard, you remember she wasn't keeping hers too good, and she was black because she'd been keeping her mother's children's vineyard, as it were. But now that the love team has worked hard on her garden, we're going to begin to see what all this is coming together to do. And so, Jesus taught on this verse clearly, several times. In so many different stories and different parables, he talked about the vineyard, but specifically in Matthew chapter 21, and then again it's repeated in both Luke and Mark, it's talked about when he let out the vineyard to these keepers, and they didn't pay the taxes, so to speak. They didn't pay the 1,000 pieces of silver. Instead, they beat the prophets, and they eventually killed his son. And then Jesus goes on to say that he's going to let that vineyard out to other keepers, which, we believe that the original ones he was talking about were the Jews who would actually kill his son. And then, give it to the church, which is us, which hopefully, again, we're going to be the total package and hopefully continue to bring these pieces of silver, which to an own extent, I think at some point in time, would literally be the Jews and the Greeks and the Romans and all the people that were possibly be able to come into this garden. But it was really, really cool, and again, speaks to the letter hoof, and just the first thing that God showed me in this verse that just literally blew my mind was when you look closely at the word silver, the Hebrew letters give us just a fantastic idea of what Jesus taught on when it came to the coins, that when they said, whose likeness is this, or where Jesus said, whose likeness is this. So when you look, when the Pharisees tried to make him, trick himself up by saying who should pay, whether or not you should pay taxes to Caesar, that story really comes together in this verse in a very beautiful way, because the idea of silver is a hoof, which has to do with the crown, and then a samach, which is the idea of support or to hold up. If you look in the 119th Psalm, you see that clearly. The samach has to do with that. And so here you see this is whatever it is supporting the crown, which silver does that in so many different ways, especially when you see it in this way, when it's being used to pay for the vineyard or to pay the taxes on the vineyard. But the last letter is the significant thing to me that just blows my mind. It's the letter pay, which has to do with your face. So when you think about silver, not only does it support the crown, but it reflects the face of, right, the master. So if Caesar is your master and your idea is that you're going to go about, doing things for Caesar, then you render unto Caesar what's Caesar's. But if the idea was to be tending Jesus's vine, which is what we're doing here, or his vineyard, Solomon's vineyard, then we're going to render unto Jesus what reflects Jesus. In other words, the silver or the fruit thereof, which also starts with the letter Pe, has to do with when you look, the old idea that when you refine silver, when the master can see his face in the reflection, the silver has been refined, right? And so here we see that as Jesus sees himself reflected in the vineyard, then he's getting his taxes. And interestingly, that word 1,000 there, that it's really huge, because that's a heck of a return on your investment as 1,000. But another interesting thing is that word is exactly the same word in Hebrew as in other words, how it's spelled is exactly the same as the word to teach or to learn. And so it's kind of neat when you think about how we work in this vineyard, that, if we learn, then we turn around and teach, and in so many different ways, based on where you're planted. And the other thing that came to my mind as I was just pondering this verse is, you might remember back in the 4th chapter where Jesus is describing us, and he says that we're a fountain of gardens and a well of living waters and streams flowing down from Lebanon. Well, when you think about that, and you think about the first Psalm, right, where it says we're going to be like oak trees planted by rivers of living waters. Well, and I don't know if you've experienced this, but I thought about this a lot over Christmas, is God has put so many amazing streams and rivers, as part of his garden, his paradise of pomegranate, so to speak. All the other believers that are in your life, they're all like all these trees that are planted right there, that God planted you, he planted me. And then because he's put us not only by his word, but by these other believers that have a relationship with God, there are so many of us that I just get a chance to go to have lunch with around Christmas and that kind of thing. And the streams of living waters that flow out of these different believers just blows my mind. And all the different ones that God has put in my path. And so as I reflect on the first Psalm, and think again about the whole idea of a garden, which is what this is all about, is how in the world are we going to get 1,000 pieces of silver? I mean, there's the big question that like, whoa, this is a high tax, And so how do we make sure that we make our payments, so to speak? And again, it's nothing that we do. That's the beauty of it. The beauty of the thing is, to me, it's interesting, as you enter into this relationship with Jesus, you go deeper in his word, and then you inherently just are fed by the Holy Spirit and by him and by the Father. And as you're fed, you just naturally want to talk about what you learned. And as you chance to share that with other believers, the thousands of pieces of silver are not something that you just got to go out, man, I really got to do a lot of work to get this 1,000 pieces of silver. It's like this comes so natural, just like actually, what I'm doing right this minute. It's so natural for me to sit down and record this for you, because I'm so excited about what God taught me about the letter hoof here, and what Jesus taught about, rendering unto Caesar what's Caesar's and rendering unto God what's God's. And here, this whole idea of the vineyard is repeated time and time and time again throughout the Song of Solomon, but also, obviously from the book of Genesis to the book of Revelation, we're going to see it again and again, that the idea is there is a harvest, okay? And there is a planting and there is watering. But the other key word that I don't want to neglect in this verse is the idea of keepers. Who are these keepers? Well, Adam was placed in the garden to keep it. And that word keep, that very word that's translated keep there in Genesis, is used in the 119th Psalm 21 times. To keep, and there's another version of the word keep that's in there another 10 times. So there's 31 times that the word keep is made reference to in the 119th Psalm, and it has to do with all these ideas of keeping commandments, keeping the law, keeping his word, and keeping the precepts, which is the meeting together of one another, which is one of the beautiful ways that, in other words, as we keep all these things that are mentioned in the 119th Psalm, the rest of it just is natural. And so it's interesting what, you may consider to be work or whatever that you're supposed to go do. What Adam got to do was just a delight as he was keeping the garden. And we get a chance to keep commandments, right? Loving one another, and loving God with our heart and soul and mind. And as we get a chance to keep precepts and meet with another and keep his judgments, right? That we know where God is judging, and we allow it's his, idea of judgment, and allow him to come in and disrupt our lives and rebuild them in so many different ways. In other words, this task of 1,000 pieces of silver seems overwhelming, but the amazing thing is God is so abundant, and if we just trust him, if we just do our part to keep those things that psalmist mentioned in the 119th Psalm, as the psalmist mentioned in the first Psalm, as the things that Jesus talked about in his teaching, clearly, it's all there at our disposal, and it's a joy to do it. It's so much fun, and so it's amazing to think that we would have that kind of harvest. But it just comes naturally, and actually the harvest is his anyway, and it's going to reflect him. And so it's pretty cool that we get a chance to reflect him in such amazing ways. I hope you enjoyed this verse as much as I did. I'll never look at it in the same way as I've had a chance to ponder over these 3 days in order to do this one podcast, which I know may be long, but I pondered a lot about this verse and the idea of the keepers, the idea of the silver, the idea of Shalom, that again is coming together, this harmony of fire and water as we get closer to heaven. Thanks for listening.